Mr. President, I am here on the floor this afternoon with my good friend from North Dakota, and I want to speak to an issue as it relates to the Iranian sanctions bill that we have on the floor in front of us. This is about an issue I think that so many of us care deeply about our own domestic production here, about the strength of our economy, the strength of our national security, and how the United States, in a global environment, really stands toe-to-toe in good, strong competition around the world. I want to speak today about U.S. oil, the ban on U.S. oil, and how this all intersects with Iran, Iranian sanctions, and specifically the sanctions on Iranian oil. I am introducing an amendment. It's a bipartisan amendment to allow U.S. oil to compete with Iranian oil on the global market. And I'm pleased to be joined in this effort by Senator Heitkamp, Senator Hoeven, Senator Lankford, and hopefully others as this discussion progresses. Iran's government is largely dependent on its exports of oil for its revenue source. It sends oil to countries such as China, Japan, India, South Korea, and the sanctions that have been imposed have really hurt. They have hurt Iran's economy. They have really been what has brought Iran to the table here. The sanctions that have been in place have cost the government in Tehran some $40 billion in lost export revenues in 2014 alone, and this is according to the Treasury Department. But under the sanctions regime and the Joint Plan of Action, countries are still able to purchase Iranian oil. And I don't think a lot of folks understand that. They think that, okay, the sanctions are in place, and so Iran can't be deriving any of the benefit from their oil exports. But in fact, countries are still able to purchase Iranian oil up to 1 to 1.1 million barrels per day. And no surprise, countries have purchased up to that limit nearly every month since the JPA was implemented back in November of 2013. So sanctions are in place, but Iran is still deriving the benefit of being able to sell Iranian oil to other nations. It is worth pointing out that this is only possible because the State Department does not include condensate in its definition of crude oil. So if you include the condensate volumes, then the 1.1 million barrel per day limit was breached back in January of 14, in February, March, April, May, June, July, July, September, October, and December, and also in February of 15, according to reports that came out of the International Energy Agency. Mr. President, it simply does not make sense for us to lift sanctions on Iranian oil while we keep them on American oil. It just doesn't make sense that we would tell Iran, we're going to allow these sanctions to be lifted over there, but by keeping our oil export ban in place, we are effectively imposing sanctions on U.S. oil producers. This is a de facto sanctions regime against ourselves. Now, you can understand why we have imposed sanctions on certain places, on Tehran and on Moscow, Damascus. But, Mr. President, we're effectively talking about sanctions on the Permian, on the Utica, on the Niobrara, on regions where we have the ability to produce a resource that helps this country, helps create jobs, helps with all aspects of our economy. And we're going to say, Iran, It's okay. We're going to relieve sanctions on you, but we're going to keep in place sanctions on U.S. oil producers. So what this amendment does, Mr. President, it adds a third section to the Corker-Cardin Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. It would require a DOE report on Iranian crude oil and condensate exports, and it would lift, then, the de facto ban on U.S. crude oil and condensate exports. It still preserves the emergency authorities of the President to prohibit exports if it's warranted. So there is that safety valve there. The deadline for submission of this report to Congress would be 60 days following the enactment of the Act. It would still be required even if an agreement with Iran was not reached, and it would effectively address two issues: the relative ability of U.S. and Iranian oil producers to compete in the global market, which is pretty important out there, and the extent to which any agreement with Iran would increase Iranian oil exports through the lifting of sanctions. So, as we know, American oil producers are generally prohibited from exporting overseas. Alaska is the one exception to the oil export ban. Very limited amount is exported over the years. Iran, on the other hand, currently exports over 1 million barrels per day of oil onto the global markets. Now, we had a hearing in the Energy Committee a week or so ago. You were there as the presiding officer. You were also there at the hearing, and we heard from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA. They estimated that lifting the sanctions on Iran would increase Iranian volumes by some 700,000 to 1 million barrels per day. So if we lift that, EIA estimates that Iran is now going to be in a situation where they would be able to put out onto the market to new, basically to new purchasers, 1 million barrels per day. Think about what that does. Giving them new markets for their oil, and as they have new markets for their oil, they get paid for it. EIA estimates that given the price of Brent being where it is in this range right now, that it would be $25 billion per year to Iran from the ability to put out onto the market, gain new customers, an extra $25 billion. How comfortable are we with that, Mr. Chairman? How much of that $25 billion is going to fund terrorist organizations, terrorists, in areas that we are fighting directly and immediately today? What kind of sense does this make, that we would say we will remove sanctions on Iran, allowing you to move your product to new customers, gain potentially $25 billion additionally into your treasury to do who knows what with? Well, at the same time, what this does is it harms American producers who are unable to compete with Iranian oil due to this outdated ban on U.S. exports that was imposed 40 years ago. So we're going to let a 40-year-old policy sanction us, sanction our economy, and benefit Iran. Lifting the ban on U.S. oil exports would let American oil compete with Iranian oil. It would reduce Iranian revenue from oil exports. It would send a strong signal to U.S. allies that still depend on Iranian oil that alternative supplies are available, and lower global oil prices, which would decrease the price of gasoline and other consumer fuels. Mr. President, just a few hours ago, on the other side of the hallway here, over in the House of Representatives, we heard from the Prime Minister of Japan. Japan is currently able to purchase from Iran oil. Don't you think that our friend Japan would much rather have security and diversity of supply if it were to come from their friend, the United States? I sure think so. The The amendment that we have introduced lifts the ban by requiring, after 30 days have elapsed from the enactment of Senate Bill 615, that crude oil exports may be authorized on the same basis that they're currently authorized for petroleum products, whether it's gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, whatever it is. But currently, these petroleum products, they can be exported without a license. In fact, we are, here in this country, the largest exporter of petroleum products in the world. So think about this as just kind of you shake your head and say, what's going on here? We're the largest exporter of refined products, but yet we impose a flat ban, an outright ban on the crude itself. So again, we've got a safety valve in the amendment that preserves the President's emergency authorities, which derive from the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the National Emergencies Act, and the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And they prohibit exports under these various proposals if needed for the safety and security of the nation. And we don't touch those. We don't impact them in that amendment at all. So it's important to recognize that what we're doing here is we're looking at an outdated policy, 40 years old. We are moving into present time and space where we have a situation where a country that we have tried desperately to bring to the table to be a nation that will work with us rather than against us. And yet, part of what we're considering is an action that would remove sanctions on them and continue to keep in place sanctions on this country. Makes no sense to me. I would hope that my colleagues would consider it. I know that my colleague from North Dakota has given great thought about this, has great understanding about the issue, and also great passion about how we ensure that from a national security perspective, we're covered in all corners. So I would ask my colleague from North Dakota, as she has reviewed, again, an antiquated and an outdated policy, how, from a producing state like North Dakota, where you are working to advance the opportunities not only for North Dakotans but for people all over this country, how people in North Dakota feel when it's suggested that we are imposing effectively domestic sanctions on them, while at the same time we would relieve sanctions on Iran.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
I want to thank my good friend from Alaska for giving me an opportunity to talk about this policy of sanctions that is wrong on so many levels. When we first look at it, we need to understand that the embargo or the limitations on exportation of crude oil in this country is a policy decision made by the President initially, President Nixon, in response to a number of producers going around oil price support controls. So this is a 1970s policy. Unfortunately, when we transitioned away from price supports for crude oil, we never removed this embargo. We never removed this restriction. That was a mistake at this time, and it continues to be a colossal mistake for our growth towards energy independence in this country and our ability to use our energy and our oil for soft power, to actually provide a consistent and ready supply of crude oil to our allies, so they are not beholden not only to Iran, but not beholden to companies like or countries like Russia. And so it is critically important that we examine some of the concerns I think that people have about lifting the embargo. Obviously, North Dakota, we don't see any logic, because we're kind of a common sense state. We don't see any logic behind not allowing crude oil to be exported, but allowing every refined product that we could produce in this country access to a foreign market. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. If the logic behind this is to try and maintain stability and a lower gasoline price, then we should lock down gasoline. We shouldn't export gasoline. I mean, the antiquated policy that we're talking about today didn't have a lot of logic after we deregulated oil. It has even less logic in the dangerous world that we live in. We know that so many of our foreign enemies rely on oil revenue to basically fund their terrorism activity, to basically fund their government, to supply the necessary government services that keep them in power. And we have an opportunity to say to our allies, whether it's Japan or in Europe, don't worry about whether somebody is going to hold you hostage because you won't be able to heat your homes in the winter or provide gasoline to your communities and your consumers. Don't worry about that, because we've got your back. But we can't have their back if we don't have the ability to export our crude oil. And the bottom line is that on every level, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of what we should be in this country, at every level, a policy of maintaining an embargo, a restriction against exports of crude oil, makes no common sense. Absolutely none. But let's talk about domestic policy, because I think some of the concerns that have been expressed to me by my colleagues, and I'm sure Senator Murkowski's colleagues, have been, well, won't this increase gasoline prices? And I have to applaud Senator Murkowski, because very early on she heard that and she said, let's have some real intellectual work done. Just don't rely on my, economics 101. How about we actually get economists from Brookings, economists from the Aspen Institute, economists all over the country who have come to one single conclusion, which is that it will not raise gasoline prices. In fact, the conclusion is quite the opposite, that allowing us access to an international market could, in fact, reduce gasoline prices. Why would that be, you wonder? Because I think the fluke of how we refine crude oil in this country, most of our refineries are based on heavy sour crude. The crude we produce in North Dakota is light sweet crude. We don't have a big refining capacity for light sweet crude, so we have a price reduction in our country. So how is gasoline prices, how are they established? They're based on that higher crude oil price, because they're refining crude oils that come in from other places like Saudi Arabia. They're refining crude oils that come in from Venezuela, and they're charging an appropriate price. Some people would say there's a little bit of price creep here as we're looking at gasoline prices, and the ability to get our crude to market is absolutely critical. Now, there's a lot of people who also think that we should keep a captive market on a lot of our resources, and we've heard this argument in natural gas, and we heard this argument in crude oil. And they think we should have a captive market. And I have a constant reply. I say I have a lot of hog farmers who like low corn prices. The solution for low corn prices have never been to not export corn. This is the only commodity that is traded on a global price that doesn't have the ability to find its market. Now, what's the consequence of that? I would tell you, to my friend in Alaska, and I think she sees this, is that one of the things I sincerely believe is that the ability to produce oil, our domestic production of oil, had a lot to do with driving Iran to the negotiating table. They saw that we could, in fact, infiltrate the markets, take market share. That's threatening to a lot of the former OPEC countries who are wanting that captive market. And so we were able to maintain, if we had access to that market, we'd be sending a message. And so why don't we do the right thing here? Why don't we understand how this export ban on American crude oil is restricting our ability to use crude oil as an appropriate soft power opportunity? Why don't we talk about how actually allowing for the export of crude oil could drive down gasoline prices in the United States of America and continue the energy renaissance? Because if we can't find our market, in North Dakota for this production, guess what happens? It either goes into storage or it gets shut in where it's at, which is in the field. And hundreds of thousands of jobs will be lost, but more importantly, our energy security in this country will be jeopardized and harmed. This policy of opening up this restriction is so right on so many levels, and I applaud the senator from Alaska for bringing it forth in this context. I think it is critical to talk about it in this context. But I also applaud her for all the work that she's done and we've supported as she's built out the case, the economic case, for why this policy makes no sense at any level. And it's wrong-headed. It's time to change it. This is an opportunity we will not end, because it is only fair to every oil field worker out there. It is only fair to every owner of a royalty or minerals in place. It's fair to every operator, and it's fair to the people of this country to engage in trade, level the playing field, and make sure that we are telling our friends and allies that they don't have to buy their oil from countries that threaten their security every day. We've got a supply of oil that can readily be exported and provided to them. So I thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my good friend from Alaska for her continuing advocacy on behalf of consumers in this country, and her continued advocacy on behalf of an energy appropriate policy in the United States of America.
Well, I thank my colleague from North Dakota. You have articulated the case so well, not only from a domestic perspective, but truly the international as well. We need to appreciate that as we are recognized as a nation, as that superpower when it comes to our military strength and all that those who serve us have to offer, that we are also an energy superpower. And we have not yet embraced that as a responsibility, as an obligation to use that to not only our advantage, but the advantage of our friends and allies around the globe. And that's an important transition, a transformation that we need to make. We are mired down in policies that are decades old, based on history that is no longer relevant given the geopolitics of today. We have an opportunity to wake up to where we can be, how we can lead from an international perspective. And it can begin with the strength of our energy and our energy resources. But we have to believe in our own possibilities. Right now, I think we're lagging in that. So I appreciate all that my colleague is doing in this effort to help educate people. I recognize that it takes a little bit of time to recalibrate the thinking, but we are doing that, and we're doing it for the right reason, based on common sense, based on strength of the economy, and based on national security, which should be our primary consideration right now. We will never have sufficient boots on the ground, budget for defense to be everywhere where many would like to be around the globe. What other assets do we have? What else can we contribute? It can begin with our energy resources. So we have great opportunities, and I look forward to further discussions about not only what we're proposing in this amendment, but how we can lead as a nation in the energy sector. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.